Terence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with Harvard professor Danielle Allen about her latest book, Radical Duke, and her ongoing work on the promise and challenges of democracy. And you can learn more, and I'm going to give you 3 places to look. The first is Danielle Allen, one word, and that's Danielle is pretty obvious, but it's A-L-L-E-N, DanielleAllen.scholars.harvard.edu. Okay? And you can also find a trove of her articles at the Atlantic magazine. And she founded and is a frequent poster at the Renovator Substack. In the course of this, we'll talk about some other organizations she's involved with where you can also go to learn more. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, health, science, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show plays on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terencemcnally.net, TERENCEMCNALLY, all one word, .net. I've been noting the work of today's guest for years. In print and on stage, I have seen her introduce herself as, quote, a Harvard scholar, professor, and a democracy advocate, giving both equal billing. And it's impressive to me how much she actually embodies that equal billing in practice. I read about her latest book in a long New Yorker review by Adam Gopnik in the June 8th edition. The book seemed a bit of a departure. Her last 2 focused on the Declaration of Independence. This one includes a bit of a detective story, and it takes place in England. So I'll let her tell the story of how this book happened, but suffice it to say I was surprised. Allen demonstrates in Radical Duke that, quote, every act that provided the drumbeat of the march to revolution in the colonies had been foreshadowed in Britain. The rights of man, the theory of revolution, and calls for popular sovereignty. All of these developed earlier in London than in the colonies, unquote. And it isn't just these big ideas that Richmond, the Radical Duke, and his circle had a hand in. Allen makes the case that he's also one of the founders of the modern political party, cross-class gatherings of like-minded folk, and the first person to envision the district-based foundation of modern democratic representation with equally populated districts. That's a lot to chew on. In terms of her advocacy for democracy, it's in her writings and her work with organizations, some of which she has founded and led. Not only that, in what seems like dark days for our American experiment, she sees positive signs, perhaps under the radar. I invited Allen to talk about Radical Duke and what she calls democracy renovation, and I'm eager to do both. And we're going to start with the new book because I'm afraid once we start talking about renovating democracy, we'd never stop. Danielle Allen is a professor of political philosophy, public policy, and ethics at Harvard University. She's director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, director of the Democratic Knowledge Project, and a James Bryant Conant University professor, one of Harvard's highest honors. She's also founder and chairperson of Partners in Democracy, where she advocates for democracy renovation to create greater voice and access in our democracy and drive progress to a new social contract that serves and includes us all. Her books include Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, Justice by Means of Democracy, and her latest, Radical Duke. She is the publisher and founder of the Renovator Substack and a contributing columnist at The Atlantic. In 2020, Allen received the Library of Congress Kluge Prize, which is their recognition for disciplines that are not covered by the Nobel. And I'm going to quote, she received it for her internationally recognized scholarship in political theory and her commitment to improving democratic practice and civics education. Welcome, Danielle Allen, to Free Forum, a world that just might work.
Thank you so much, Terrence. I love the title of your show. It's
Oh,
great.
yes, yes, yes. As I point out when people say, it's been going on for so many years now, it doesn't happen that often. But originally, people, why didn't you just say a world that works? And I said, because it's
Right.
subjunctive case for a reason.
Exactly. It's awesome. Don't have to give up. It just might work, but there's some
That's
things we got
right.
to do to see that it
That's
happens.
right.
So
But there's an ask in that, if you will.
exactly. There's some agency that must be exercised if it's in fact going to work. Yeah.
We are in sync. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Thursday, July 30th, 2026. So, first of all, Danielle, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas we talk about. So, can you tell us briefly how you see your path to the work you do today? And feel free to go all the way back to childhood inspirations, mentors,
Hmm.
turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing.
All righty. Well, I mean, my path does go all the way back. I come from generations of people who have loved and fought for democracy. I often share that my granddad on my dad's side helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. So lynchings were on the rise at the time. So that was super dangerous work. He was taking his life into his hands to fight for the right to vote, basically. So it is very clear, empowerment for himself and his community was necessary to human flourishing. On my mom's side, same sort of story. My great grandparents helped fight for women's right to vote. So I love to elevate my great grandmother, who ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. And also my great granddad, who marched with suffragists on Boston Common in 1917. We forget actually just how hard 1917 was. In that year, President Wilson had the military in the streets of DC to suppress protests of suffragists. So, again, just like my granddad, my great grandparents as well, they were putting various kinds of forms of kind of material security at risk because they so believe that empowerment is the bedrock of human thriving. So I was lucky. I grew up in a kind of very big extended family that had this inheritance. As a kid, I have to confess, I sort of took the value of democracy for granted. I just thought it was like a good thing, and these institutions were here for us to solve our problems, to work together, et cetera, and that empowerment was real. As I was coming of age, coming up in the world, what happened was there was just this real kind of split in life paths between myself and some of my cousins. So I've had incredible opportunities, but I have too many cousins who are no longer on this planet. And for all of the hardest things we struggle with as a society. So addiction, substance use disorder, gun violence, incarceration, severe mental illness. I lost my youngest cousin, Michael, in 2009. You've probably read about
Let me
that.
cut in for one quick second. I was going to, in the course of this, ask about that book, um,
Okay.
Cuz Michael A.
Yeah.
Because when I first looked, I went, which one of these is not alike? And they
Right.
seem to be
Exactly.
different. So, I mean,
Mhm.
if you want to take a moment to focus on that specific one in your story, go right ahead.
Sure. Well, so I lost my cousin Michael. Michael is my favorite cousin, the baby cousin of this huge extended clan. I mean, honestly, I have countless cousins. I don't know how many cousins I have, but Michael was the youngest, and it was probably the first baby I ever held. I was very close to him, and he and his siblings and his mom kind of came in and out of our house while he was growing up. Living with us sometimes. Anyway, Michael did a terrible thing when he was 15, made a terrible mistake. He committed an attempted carjacking in California in 1995. That landed him in prison. It was just after California had passed the three strikes you're outlaw. So even though it was a first offense, people don't realize you can get more than one strike in a single offense, actually. So
I'd
it's just
forgotten that.
however many felonies are in the actual incident. Anyway, he was facing 25 years to life, took a plea deal. At the age of 15, he had a sentence of 12 years and 8 months. He served most of that. I always say in our big family, there was always, somebody in trouble and then, a cousin on duty, like cousin in trouble, cousin on duty. So I was Michael's cousin on duty. So I spent a lot of time while he was inside trying to help him get education. And then I was the person who was, the cousin on duty for reentry. So when he left prison, helping with housing and job and school and the like. And basically, there's just this one moment I remember kind of sitting in a car in LA, summer of 2006, hot sun, looking at a map and feeling in my bones, like, how is this going to work? Because school was in one place, and then the only place I would even look at him for in a job like was miles away, and then housing was in a third place. And it just felt impossible kind of to put the pieces together. And I kind of felt like this sense of the social contract kind of crumbling in my own spirit, right? Like there's this idea, if you work hard, even if you screwed up, if you're ready to make amends, if you're ready to work hard, you should be able to make it work. And it just felt like it was going to be impossible to put the pieces together. And so then, in fact, he didn't make it. I mean, he had about 2 years out ultimately before he was terribly shot and killed by somebody he had met while he was inside. So that was just devastating. And it was a kind of life turning point moment for me. And so I was at that point already, a historian of democracy, a kind of theorist of democracy. And that scholarly work had been built on this kind of inherited appreciation for democracy. But suddenly I was having my own kind of crisis of confidence in democracy. And just kind of came face to face with the fact that democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable, right? At the end of the day, the reason we embrace these ideals is because that project of empowerment should deliver a society that makes it possible for every generation to do a bit better than the previous, and also for a whole, generational cohort to come up together, not have this incredible pulling apart of experience that we were seeing in my family. Yeah. So at any rate, the short of it is that this is where it comes together into the sort of work I do now. I started banging my head on the question of how could we change the dynamics of our democracy so that it could actually deliver on the promise of democracy. And first, that meant a few years, 2009 to 2013, working on criminal justice reform. But that very quickly taught me the lesson that even where there were common sense and cross-partisan solutions to kind of glaring problems, it was impossible to get them through our Congress because of the degree of polarization and dysfunction. So Congress had an approval rating of 9% in 2013, and that was my red alert for the health of our democracy. So I pivoted in 2013 to this work that I call democracy renovation. And it is three things. It is reconnecting people to their civic experience, power, and responsibility, largely through civic education. It is redesigning our political institutions so they're more responsive to people. That includes electoral reform. I'm working on a ballot initiative now. And then it is...
I would imagine campaign finance, of course.
Exactly. That's in there for sure. Absolutely. And then lastly, it's about democracy supportive policy. Too often policymakers have been making policy, for example, trade liberalization, and taking for granted, democracy as a background condition, not considering, does this policy help or harm democracy sort of over the long term? So I work on all three of those buckets now, and it comes out of this belief, inherited from my grandparents and great-grandparents in empowerment as the bedrock for human thriving, but also a recognition that the reality of our world right now is that we're not actually delivering that empowerment or thriving for people.
Very good, very good. So as I said in the intro, we're going to deal with the book first, and then we'll jump back to into the democracy arena. So how did this book happen? I promised in the intro also that you would tell, right, because it is a cool story.
It's a fun story. I think it's honestly one of the most fun things I've ever had the chance to work on. And it is crazy because writing a biography of a very wealthy 18th century British aristocrat was, not on my personal bingo card. Okay. Not something I imagined doing. But as you know, and as many people know about me, I have this kind of obsession with the Declaration of Independence. I'm coming, Abraham Lincoln at one point said he never had a political instinct that didn't come from the Declaration of Independence. And I'm coming to feel the same way. So anyway, my obsession led to this crazy project about a decade ago to find every copy of the Declaration published between 1776 and 1826. I will spare you why I was doing that. But that yielded this surprise find of a second ceremonial parchment manuscript of the Declaration. The world thought there was one. It's in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., encased in preservative gases. But it turns out there's a whole other one, and it's in this tiny little archive in southern England.
And let me just jump in for a second, because when I first read that, I said, wait a minute, there's more. You say parchment. Right. That's the distinction here, that we thought there was only one existing parchment one.
Ceremonial parchment manuscript. So ceremonial, it's big, okay? and then parchment, and then manuscript is written out by hand. So in the 1820s, people started making parchment engravings of the Declaration, but an actual ceremonial scale parchment written out by hand, there's one in the National Archives, and there's one in Chichester, England, okay, in the place where you would normally go to get your marriage license. So anyway, then that's a mystery. Like, how on earth did it get there? It fairly quickly came to light that it had most likely gotten there through the papers of an 18th century politician, Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond. His family solicitor's papers had ended up in the archives. But so then there was the second question of, well, how did he get it? He was known to support the Americans. He, stood up in Parliament and read the Declaration of Independence out loud in the 1770s and advocated for recognizing American independence. He was the first politician to do so. But still, there was a mystery. And I will be honest, the mystery, in some sense, it was solved by a London cabbie. I learned, as a matter of happenstance, from a conversation with a cabbie that Thomas Paine, famous writer of Common Sense, famous political radical, had lived in Lewes, England for 6 years, from 1768 to 1774, working as a tax collector. Now, Lewes, which is not where Paine was from someplace north of London called Thetford. So that's why I had never associated Paine with Southern England. He was from Thetford. But it turns out he was in Sussex, the same county, the Duke's county, where the Duke was Lord Lieutenant and was a sort of overarching political authority in the same years. So I started pulling at that thread because that just seemed too proximate. I mean, that my hunch was there had to be a connection. So I pulled and pulled and pulled. And after a lot of pulling, what fell out of the research in the archives was this incredible story that the Duke was Thomas Paine's first political patron, that he engaged him and other writers like Edmund Burke among them in writing a series of radical essays countering the king in London, 1768 to 1772, and developing this sort of constitutional theory for the way in which parliament should be supreme to protect British liberties, that it was important to get the kind of overreaching crown back under control. So lo and behold, there was this kind of story of radicalism, welling up in England that was earlier than the equivalent story in America. Much closer connection between the two sides of the ocean with regard to their critiques of the king and what they saw as the best alternatives. And yeah, it was just a huge amount of fun to kind of follow that all through and then discover who this crazy Duke was.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was I'd never thought about our founders or our patriots' earlier lives in England. In other words, for me, Thomas Paine was an American. Well, there was no such thing as an American when Thomas Paine moved here, and he did have a life beforehand. That was one of those real flips in my mind of like, I hadn't looked through that door before.
He had a whole story, in other words.
Yeah. In terms of resonance to our moment, you point out that two of the prominent issues that Richmond, Paine, and Richmond's circle, which, as you point out, included Burke and the Junius letters, but that they were dealing with corruption and who gets to vote.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we could say, besides the war, those are two of the biggest issues we face in the U.S. at this moment.
You betcha. Yeah, no, I mean, that was the thing. Originally, when I found this parchment, I was kind of resentful, actually, okay, because American politics were going crazy, and I just felt like there was so much work to do for our democracy. The idea of having a sense of obligation as a scholar to spend time in the archives was really hard for me, actually, because you find a parchment like that, you can't just ignore it. You have to actually figure out what it is.
And yet it felt like a tangent.
It did, like a total distraction. Like, how could I go bury myself in the archives in 2016, 2017, 2018? Who could do that? But as I did, the more I got into it, I realized that it kind of opened up into this amazing case study of exactly the problems that we're confronting today. And so suddenly it was this huge source of, renewal and insight for understanding the dynamics of a system where the executive is just ever more concentrating power, the legislature is ever more dependent, cronyism and corruption become the defining dynamic of the system, and you want to like break that open and get out of it. Like, how do you do that? And we Americans, we don't actually have that many kind of historical case studies for ourselves to draw on. You know, we have the post-Watergate moment, we have some of the kind of 19th century fighting of Tammany Hall and corruption, but we don't really have a kind of case in our own history of the magnitude to meet our current moment. And so suddenly I was like, this is the case. Like, this is the historical kind of pre-example that can help one see a pathway out of the problems we're experiencing.
And one thing that struck me was I project, if I go, well, gee, I didn't know that. I project that most people don't know it, but bear with me. I don't think I thought about challenges to the monarchy. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, look, so here's the thing that's so amazing about this. You thought that because Thomas Paine and the Americans, they did their narrative work so well, right? Thomas Paine always said he never published anything before Common Sense, that America was the place that made him. Why did he have to say that? Because what he had been doing in England was seditious. He would have been put on trial. I mean, the people who published him were put on trial. So he had to cover it up. So that story got buried. And we have all bought it hook, line, and sinker. Relatedly, the Declaration of Independence, text that I love. Although I love it, right? It is also at some level a propaganda text. And the propaganda that it was, you know, perpetuating was the idea that America was here and England was there, and that they were two separate things. And it was America against all of England, both king and parliament. And that just actually wasn't true. There were genuinely allies in Britain of the Americans. I mean, there was meaningful truth to it because parliament was dependent on the king. And so that kind of combination was against the Americans in a very sort of strong and intense way. But the kind of binary narrative of that text has taught all of us Americans to think in that binary way.
And we love thinking that we're exceptional.
Yeah, exactly.
That we thought of it first, and it was all us, and
That's right. Yes, yes.
It fits in one of our larger narratives.
That is true.
Quickly, this thinking that Richmond and his circle are doing, it as you point out, it sort of predates what's going to happen in France. It predates what happens in America. Even the king was influenced by the Enlightenment. Just talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's an interesting sort of a bittersweet part of the book is that, we think of the king as a tyrant, and obviously the people I was writing about also thought of him and called him, tyrant and despot and things like that. But he had some, redeeming virtues. One of them was learning. I mean, he left, like 90,000 books when he died, and he was the greatest patron of the arts, that's ever existed, ultimately. And so he was actually quite a serious person. He was trying to understand good governance in England. His goal was to break the power of crony-ish aristocratic cabals. So, okay, fine. One can have a little bit of sympathy with that, right? And the only problem was that the way he was breaking their power was by concentrating power in himself. Right. So, but he had learned to think about constitutionalism from Montesquieu, the same people that Richmond was learning from, that the founders were learning from, and so forth. So he was part of the same conversation, and just sitting on the throne rather, led him to a kind of different set of solutions. And solutions ultimately that, how to put it, I think, not the right ones in the 1760s and 1770s. On the other hand, in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, he did begin to accept limits on the crown's authority. So,
yeah. So our founding story emphasizes the fight for independence, obviously, and that occurs to me as a simple yes or no, in or out. We're colonies or we're our own nation. But the more contentious questions and the more original solutions are about what form the new government takes.
Yep.
And that's really people had fought for independence throughout history, right? Usually replacing with a form similar to the one they overthrew. And this notion of, wait, we're going to do something new. And new institutions, new ways of going about it is quite a big deal. And as you point out, the Even the Declaration begins to get into that, right? You point out the
Yeah.
value of sentence number 2.
Right, right, exactly. Sentence number 2, which is the long, we hold these truths to be self-evident sentence. It's a sort of theory of revolution and the importance of building institutions to secure the safety and happiness of the people. The list of grievances is also important because it's organized as a set of complaints about each of the 3 kinds of power in government: legislative power, and then judicial power, and then executive power. So you can see a kind of constitutional thinking working already in the Declaration. But I think the real story in that moment is that, in 1770, let's just say, on this side of the Atlantic and that side of the Atlantic, everybody thought of themselves as British subjects. And as British subjects, they had a strong sense of there being a certain set of liberties that British subjects had: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, that was growing and not perfect yet, but there, freedom, right to trial by jury, and the freedom to have a legislature that would set the direction for the country instead of a king. So the king had to work for the legislature, not the other way around. And like that basic picture was really about protecting people from domination, protecting them from sort of arbitrary imposition of restraints and expropriations. And so then the hard question was, okay, if that's actually the core, how do you build a society that's going to protect that? Everybody kind of was in agreement, like this monarchy thing wasn't working. Okay, so then, what's the alternative? So that's why, you have the Americans sort of start out with, an entity without an executive at all, the Articles of Confederation. It's like that's kind of the first effort at it.
Yeah.
And so it's an experiment, right? It's like that's a genuine American experiment. It's like the Articles of Confederation. And it's an experiment that doesn't work because it turns out you do need some kind of executive power. And so then with the Constitution, they actually add, the second branch. They have Congress is still first, but Article 2, the presidency. And the biggest debates are, have they, are they going to end up with a king again or not? And so this is the sort of like the hard problem that they're kind of wrestling through. And how do you actually build something that is truly government by the people?
Yeah. I mean, and it's you started this book and engaged this question. You're talking about 16, 17, 18. No kings.
Right. Exactly.
Is
it's the direct heir. It's the direct heir. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's the direct heir. So that's to say, it's totally parallel. And then the only thing that's different is, in the 18th century, there was so much institutional experimentation happening all over the place. Not always for good, results. Like Sweden, there's a coup. The king takes over and forms a fully autocratic government. There are some experiments in Poland with a bit more kind of representation of the people. There's sort of some small scale experiments in places, I think, like Sardinia and Majorca, places like that. So, I mean, there's like stuff happening. People are kind of trying things out. Switzerland is kind of making adjustments with its canton system. Whereas right now, with the No Kings movement, when that sort of kicks off, we're in a world where there's a lot of democratic backsliding around the whole world. And there is some positive experimentation, but most people don't actually have visibility into it or access to it. So like Taiwan has been hugely experimental, actually. Estonia has been quite experimental. So there are places around the world where people are kind of developing some new ways of doing self-government that we could learn from here in the US. And then, of course, there's like the small efforts in states that become like much more important once you realize that, like answering this question of like, how do we, redo these institutions for our new 21st century conditions does actually require experimentation. So we really do need our states to be like trying different forms of, blocking kind of oligarchic capture of our institutions.
Yeah. Let me tell people this is free forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally, and I'm speaking with Harvard professor Danielle Allen about her latest book, Radical Duke, and her ongoing work on the promise and challenges of democracy. And you can learn more at Danielle Allen, one word, and that's ALLEN, Danielle Allen, one word, .scholars.harvard.edu. And you can also find her archive at the Atlantic Magazine and she founded and writes often in the Renovator Substack. One thing that occurred to me that I'm just going to throw out there, which is that when the in the early days of Trump and the claims of MAGA that they were the patriots and so on, I really felt that they would have had red hats that said "Make the colonies great again."
Right. You mean
they would have been on the wrong. They would have been on the wrong side of that one, as their love of their monarch, in D.C.
Well, yeah, good question. I'm trying to think if there are any sort of parallels in that regard. I mean, actually, here's an example for you. I don't know how long you want to stay in the 18th century, but if you want to stay in the 18th century, in 1780, or I'm trying 1780, 1790. Actually, I think this is the 1790 moment. So actually, maybe this is in the 1790 moment when the French Revolution has started. There is also radicalism in England in an effort among radicals even to try to have a whole national convention, just copying the French, right? Like that's how the French Revolution started. So as you might imagine, that was extremely alarming to the government. And so they did organize grassroots societies all over England in favor of the king. And they succeeded. I mean, they really sort of stood those up. So the kind of disorder and turbulence of France drove so much fear in the general population that it did produce a kind of strong resurgence of support at the grassroots level for the monarch.
Well, one of the other things that I learned talking with Daniel Ziblatt, colleague of yours at Harvard, were they called states already? I can't remember. Virginia, Massachusetts.
Oh, Commonwealth. Virginia is still a Commonwealth, and Massachusetts is still a Commonwealth.
Their constitutions were more democratic than the ultimate federal one, which emerges. And he says partly because the first ones followed the Declaration of Independence, but in that decade in between, the folks in charge got nervous about the majority.
I mean, yes, the moment in 1776 was a more democratic moment than the moment in 1787. That is exactly right. And there were, reasons for the retrenchment. I mean, the Articles of Confederation structure wasn't functioning, right? Congress couldn't get a quorum, rather. They couldn't pass a budget. They were dealing with kind of episodic rebellions in different places around the states and the like. So yes, I mean, I think it is fair to say that, and women had the right to vote in New Jersey until 1807, for example. So there were many ways in which things were more democratic first, and then there was a little bit of walking back from that.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think it's just an interesting twist that I had been unaware of previously. Okay, I mentioned in the introduction three entities that you're involved with, and I just love you to tell me what the three of them do. The Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, the Democratic Knowledge Project, and Partners in Democracy.
Okay, I'm going to give you one more to a fourth one called Coalition for Healthy Democracy. Okay.
Very good.
And now, although your listeners won't be able to see this, you're going to see me like switching hats really, really fast. Okay. Because two hats I wear as a Harvard professor, and then two hats I wear as citizen Danielle, right?
Yeah.
So that's that double role that you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
So why do I wear so many hats? I learned some lessons from the natural sciences, and you're an expert in the natural sciences too. So this will connect to some of your other topics. I, watched my science colleagues all through the 90s and early 2000s as I was a young professor, really scale their impact as the sciences were building this translational infrastructure. And I wanted to learn from that. It seemed to me there's no reason people in the humanities and social sciences couldn't also use lab structures for their work. I mean, the beauty of a lab is just that you've got like more brains working on a problem, right? Like we don't have to do everything solo. We can work in teams. And if you work in a team, you just by definition will have a bigger impact because like you're putting more brain power to work on the problem. But to get all the good for humanity that can come out of sort of lab-based teamwork, you need vehicles external to the university that can scale up the findings. So think in bench science, somebody discovers mRNA, but then you have a Moderna or a Pfizer that can scale up that beautiful discovery of biology in the form of vaccine production and, interrupt the COVID pandemic. So that's sort of what my ecosystem is: two labs on campus that do bench science, and then external entities that are the scaling vehicles. So I said democracy renovation consists of culture work and institutional work and policy work. The culture work is civic education. The institutional work is redesigning our political institutions, campaign finance reform, revising our election systems, and so forth. And then the policy work is about how do you actually make policy that's actually good for democracy and not degrading democracy.
And so that policy piece, by the way, means policies that people might not think of immediately as having to do with how the government's structured and so on, but that your housing policy, your labor policy, those sorts of things.
Exactly. Every other policy domain, you can actually
run
approach
it through
the
that
way
filter.
Exactly. Yes, you've got it.
Which clearly is not done. I mean,
no, it hasn't, because people just took democracy for granted as a background condition. So they stopped even thinking about it or asking this question. So it's about like bringing that question back to life for people. Like, what kind of labor policy actually supports having a democracy where people are empowered? What kind of housing policy supports having people be able to be committed to a place so they can actually participate as citizens? Like, they actually need access for housing, and it has to be affordable if they're going to be able to commit as citizens to a specific place. So things like that.
Even work-life balance to some extent, so they have time to be citizens.
Exactly, that's right. So yes, like, how do we think about the protection of the work week and the kind of time allocations, or even the control of an employee on the job of their own time? Do they have stability in their scheduling, or is somebody arbitrarily moving their schedule around all the time? That will affect whether they can actually have a civic role. And so, my kind of starting premise is that everybody needs access to a civic role in order to have access for full flourishing. Not everybody will accept the invitation to a civic role. People will make their own choice, but everybody should have that possibility, that access and that invitation.
And obviously childcare and elder care would come hugely into this, because they become the thing that you do in addition to your work. And suddenly your life is gone.
Exactly, right. And there's no time for that civic space either. So, and various kinds of mutual aid and solidarity are part of the work that you need to do too, to make space for the time available for civic things. So the Ed School Lab does the civic education work and the kind of civic culture work. And that's K through 12 and higher ed. And then the Kennedy School Lab does the institutional design work and the policy work. And then Partners in Democracy is a 501c3 that scales up the civic education work and a lot of civic engagement work and building digital civic infrastructure. And then the Coalition for Healthy Democracy is a ballot initiative in Massachusetts, where this November we are trying to pass an all-party primary ballot initiative. So that's the whole sort of suite of things.
Very good, very good. By the way, it seems like you may be aware, but I did a podcast series for the Weiss Institute at Harvard.
Yes.
And that embodies some of
exactly
what you picked up from the science, where they got the labs, and boy, did I learn the value of postdocs.
Right.
And then they have entrepreneurial folks on the team to turn it into impact. And if your science project doesn't look like it's going to have impact in the real world, that's a vote against you. So, I mean, I really applaud you for what you're doing. Let me jump to civic education, which I know is a key piece. And I'm going to read, I think this is a statement of yours. Frequently, when people decry the state of our politics, the conversation always lands in the same place, a lament that we just don't have civic education anymore. And you say, I want people to know this is no longer true. The decline of civic education hit bottom about a decade ago and is at last on the rebound. And that fact brings you hope. Talk about that, because I was surprised.
Yeah. So I'm going to do two things. Let me say one more thing about the kind of ecosystem I've built, and then I'll connect that to your question about civic education.
Sure.
So I'm basically like working on a moonshot for American democracy here, where the idea is that you have to kind of, in a holistic way, upgrade how democracy is functioning along both the culture and the institutional accesses simultaneously. And in order to move both accesses simultaneously, you have to do that in a place-based way. So here in Massachusetts, we are working on building a kind of upgraded democracy stack, upgraded civic education, upgraded democracy institutions, upgraded democracy policy, all at once so that you can actually then go ahead and measure like before and after. Have you moved the needle on responsiveness to citizen needs and concerns? Have you moved the needle on people's trust in institutions? Have you moved the needle on people's sense of empowerment and dignity? And so then if you can do that in one place, then you can like teach everybody else how to do it too. And we can sort of lever the whole system up another level. So civic education, yes. There's a big community around the country that has been working on rebuilding civic learning infrastructure for 20 years. And with every decade, the work has kind of accelerated like to another level of investment and energy. And we're like going through another acceleration again. So, we did hit bottom about a decade ago. We can see that in polling results and test scores. A decade ago, a quarter of Americans could name the three branches of government. Now it's like 70% of Americans can name all three branches. You can see a lot of movement of that kind, and also movement for young people. And so the good news is that there's this like national network of people who are kind of working on an aligned strategy. That's what makes it powerful. It means we're kind of finally making progress. So people are working at the state level. That's where you have to work and focus. That's actually where the meat of everything that matters in American life is at the state level. So you have to be able to like coordinate across states. So we're doing this work in Massachusetts to kind of build a model, as I said, but also working to build these really big horizontal coordinating networks so that we can kind of lever the model into the sort of basis for a kind of aligned national strategy for a lot of different civil society actors.
It sounds like a ALEC for democracy. And for listeners who don't know what I'm talking about, what is that? The Alliance of Legislative something, ALEC. But they come up with policies, usually right wing, or let's say always right wing policies they want to do, and then they come up with models, and then they spread them state by state.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way, I suppose. I just think of it as a moonshot for democracy.
So. Right. Moonshot has a much better feeling to it. But I think it's interesting that first of all, a scholar looks at kind of the world of ideas, and then they might look at big picture ideas. What is democracy? But I think with the founding of the Massachusetts organization, you clearly go for real impact in the real world. You need to get more focused than that, and that states are the place where experiments happen. California, obviously, where I reside, has had that going for a number of years. We're far from perfect, but we take swings.
Exactly. Yeah, no, you do take swings. And I think if I'm right, you guys may be working on taking the next step. So you guys have an all-party primary. The version we're moving forward has some improvements on it compared to the California version. But even beyond that, I think you guys, I've been hearing that there's sort of new efforts brewing to now layer in ranked choice voting to your system, which would be a terrific next step. Oftentimes people don't sort of get, though, that like there is order of operations here. Like you have to take one step at a time. That is the problem. Each of our states is like this antique clock. And, to renovate it is like, we're not like tossing it out and like starting from scratch. And so then that really does mean you have to like layer in the new pieces like one step at a time and kind of take the operations of the whole thing up. That can be frustrating to people. It takes a long time, but it's the nature of the beast. So anyway, I'm excited to see what's coming for California as you guys look to new improvements. And as I said, we've got a version of the all-party primary where we've already made some improvements compared to the California version, and we look forward to continued ratcheting up of reform.
It's like when I talk to someone like Ziblatt or some other folks about the Constitution and its flaws. We may have done the first one, but then the folks who followed us were able to go, well, maybe that electoral college isn't the best idea. Maybe there's another way to do proportional representation and so on. I want you to talk just about briefly, but I thought it was so interesting where you were talking about in your civic education work, you had people from sort of both sides interested, and you had to find terminology and visions that worked for both. You talked about democracy, republic, and patriotism and solidarity and all of those sorts of things. If you could just briefly talk about that, because I think it'll trigger things in people's minds.
Well, I think I said that there's a whole coalition across the country that is rebuilding civic learning infrastructure. One important element of that was a project called Educating for American Democracy, a group of people who came together and said, look, the reason our civic learning infrastructure has degraded so badly is actually because of polarization, because the adults are fighting so badly, they can't agree on what the kids should learn, and therefore the kids get taught nothing. So we thought that in order to solve that problem, what we actually had to do is crack through polarization. We had to build a cross-ideological group that would seek to answer the question of what is excellence in history and civic learning. So that was the project. Pulled together this group of 300 people, came from all parts of the landscape. And we agreed, as we proceeded to try to answer this question, that if we hit stuff we disagreed on, we wouldn't paper it over. We would just sort of stop and wrestle it through until we came up with an answer. So we were 2 weeks into our work when we got into a fight over whether we were educating kids for life in a democracy or life in a republic.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So that's, it's a red herring argument from my point of view. At the founding, both terms were used, but it has become, a thing that people genuinely argue about. It's a real contest. So as we debated, we hit pause on the work and had our debates. And as we debated, it became clear that the people advocating for democracy were prioritizing universal participation, inclusion, popular sovereignty. The people arguing for a republic were prioritizing constitutionalism, rule of law, sort of structure and order. So we thought, look, there's values on both sides of that matter. Like, how can we combine the values that matter into one phrase? So we decided that we were educating kids for life in a constitutional democracy. So we had similar fights around the terms patriotism and solidarity. Patriotism seems, from the point of view of people on the right, a necessary word to describe people's ties to this country and to each other. Solidarity, same for the left. On the left, folks are worried that patriotism turns into jingoism, a kind of unthinking acceptance of the nation and sort of nationalism. And solidarity for folks on the right connotes sort of too much in the way of socialism, communism, et cetera. So at any rate, again, we debated, and the values that surfaced that needed to be combined were kind of love of country and the notion that we should be able to appreciate the country's achievements and scaffold and develop positive bonds to the country. But that should come along with the ability to be critical, to see clearly where the country is failing to deliver on its promise, and to be prepared to move beyond that and make improvements. So that yielded the concept of reflective patriotism as the sort of disposition that we thought was important to cultivate for young people. So those are some examples of a couple of debates that we had.
It's just, we sort of know these debates are going on, but the notion of saying we're going to work together because we all want civic participation. So we've got to find, I just think, as I said, that might trigger things for people. I'm going to ask some sort of big questions in like the 10 minutes we have left. It seems to me that Americans have a huge deficit of trust. They lack trust in science, the press, government, institutions. And I don't think this is just on one side. It may take different forms. It may have different targets. But how crucial do you think that trust deficit or rebuilding trust or renovating trust? And how do we do that?
So, trust is a really important element in a functioning democracy. You're never going to get to perfect trust. And to some extent, there were political scientists in the 20th century who made the point that a healthy democracy has a lot of distrust in it. You should always distrust the government.
Right. Just like science has
distrust power.
It's part of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So what matters, though, is that citizens trust each other or are able to prove themselves trustworthy to each other. That's what really matters. And that's been the most alarming indicator, namely Americans' trust in one another has been on this very painful decline in the past decade. So that does require reversal. It's everything we've been talking about. For people to trust institutions need to be responsive. For people to trust each other, they need to actually be able to work together in context of shared purpose. So you have to create containers for that, actual opportunities for people to do that kind of work together. So it's all doable. There's any number of small projects, micro projects that can prove that they're moving the needle on trust. And so the challenge is how to scale that up, essentially.
Okay, here's another one. conversations with Branko Milanovic, a economist who's very big on inequality, equality, and so on, and with Rebecca Henderson, who's at the Harvard Business School and so on. They both, when we were talking about capitalism, they both, say, yeah, there's good. It's a powerful engine for innovation, et cetera, et cetera. But that when capitalism becomes corrupted is when it gets to write its own rules. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that from those two different sort of angles, they both said it. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly in the Citizens United and the latest Supreme Court decision, which says now that they can even coordinate, which that was sort of the fig leaf that was on that stuff before. Any thoughts about that notion that the real issue with what's going on is not capitalism, it's not pursuit of profit, it's when they write their own rules and suddenly the game breaks?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, markets are a valuable form of human social organization. This is a place where I agree with Hayek. Like, markets move information. They are not the only thing that we need. We also need the public sector. We also need civil society. So solving our collective action problems takes all three things, markets, public sector, and kind of civil society, mutual aid kind of arrangements. And, different roles for each, different kinds of combinations of those three forms of human social organization for different problems. But it does mean that you need markets and capitalism that, sort of live in a rule-based environment that protects the rule of law, protects basic human dignity, et cetera. So yes, the question of who writes the rules is the important question. That is where I do come back to Lincoln, right? The notion that government is for the people, if and only if it is by the people. So that is the sort of simple story, the sort of simple algorithm. It is about the rule writing power. And yes, I mean, that's why we should all be so concerned when the way money in politics is operating, does mean that the people are not the ones writing the rules. So I'm a big fan of the work of an organization called American Promise. I don't know if you've come across them yet.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah. So, they're working on a constitutional amendment. I think the For Our Freedom Amendment, and to end, the designation of corporations as persons for purposes of political speech rights. There are up to 25 states that have passed resolutions calling on their congressional delegations to trigger the amendment process. The last two that passed it were Oklahoma and Idaho, and the Oklahoma legislature voted unanimously for this. So it really is a kind of cross-partisan point of view. And it's an indicator that we really ought to be able to build a supermajority for democracy, a supermajority that wants to see the people writing the rules.
Yeah. I think, obviously, when we look back, the deterioration of democracy, it followed the money. Mm-hmm. Here's a question that is I've found unsettling, and it's gotten more unsettling. And that is that when I look at a big existential crisis like climate, and I look at things like the way our democracy functions, it ends up saying China may be the country that saves the planet from climate crisis because authoritarianism has certain advantages. It can pivot quicker, it can mobilize better, things like that. And I used to think, what does it mean if we allow China to become that, and what's the impact on authoritarianism? In the course of the last few years, our government has become quite authoritarian as well, but lacking the future vision of China, so that it's even worse. Any thoughts about that contest between the utility of democracy and the utility of authoritarianism in the face of such crises?
I mean, at the end of the day, there are a heck of a lot of costs that come with where the places that China is succeeding. I mean, there are whole communities of people whose rights are just terribly violated. And also people who have been forcibly moved and so forth as a part of kind of rearranging the economy and the like. So, I mean, I think if one, takes China as an example, one is actually accepting a really terrible cost as the price for movement on climate. that's not a cost I'm willing to accept, in all honesty. That is to say, like, if you save the climate, but like you've destroyed half the people, that I'm not sure you've actually done the job. So at any rate, I think the job is to align that protection of basic human rights and basic liberties with the governing capacity to solve these problems. But that for me is why like the renovation work is so important, because we don't have the governing capacity operating right now. And so it is kind of urgent that we acquire that. But yeah, that for me is the only path that I can be on, because I'm not able to look past those kinds of rights violations.
Oh,
So
I absolutely agree. It's always struck me as what a stark future that is. That
yeah,
if we have been such poor stewards of
right,
democracy that we cede the ability to succeed
right.
to authoritarianism,
That's well put. Yeah,
we've lost everything.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's well put. I would agree with
Okay,
you.
I think we
So
got to bring this to a close. If you want to give a kind of a final word to anyone, feel free.
I think just thank you. Appreciate the conversation. You know, sitting here working on a moonshot to renew the promise of self-government. Make sure that self-government is connected to governing capacity. That's the work. I'm delighted to, you know, meet another fellow traveler. So thank you so much for engaging in the conversation.
Very good. So again, the book is Radical Duke. The websites are Danielle Allen, one word, Danielle Allen, ALLEN, .scholars.harvard.edu. Also find her at the Atlantic Magazine, and the Renovator Substack. For this conversation and many others, and articles and so on, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, all one word, terrencemcnally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to get my weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to 10 or 15 articles to flesh out the conversation, email me at TEMcNally, one word, at mac.com. You'll find years of podcasts at my site and at most of those sites. There's, I think, like 700, believe it or not.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty crazy.
That's a lot.
And finally, my thanks to Keanu Williams in production, and to George Vasilopoulos of Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Danielle Allen, and keep up your good
Thank
work.
you. Thank you. Great to talk with you. All right.
Absolutely.
Take
Okay,
care. Nice to see
super.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was everything I hoped.
Oh, no, it was fun. Thank you very much.